The wind didn't just howl, it screamed with the intent to bury her. Eleanor Davis's lungs burned, each breath a mouthful of ice. Her boots were sodden, her heavy skirts dragging through the drifts like anchors. To the world she left behind, Eleanor was the unfortunate daughter, the one people looked at, but never to. "Just a little further," she gasped, her voice lost to the gale. Then a shape materialized through the white, a cabin hewn from ancient cedar. With the last of her strength, she threw herself against the heavy oak door. It swung open to reveal a man who looked like he had been carved from the mountain itself. Henry Smith stood like a titan, draped in furs, his eyes sharp as flint. Henry's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening in clear displeasure at the intrusion. He opened his mouth to tell her to move on, but the lantern light hit her face, flushed, desperate, and hauntingly beautiful. Before he could speak, Eleanor's knees buckled. Henry caught her, and in that moment, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm he felt stirring in his chest. But can Eleanor's scarred heart accept the truth before it is too late? Stay to the very end to witness a love that defies every expectation and proves she was always a queen. Chapter 1. The Before, the Frozen Threshold. The rattling of the rented carriage had been the only rhythm Eleanor Davis could cling to, a mechanical heartbeat against the encroaching silence of the Sierra Nevada. But then the rhythm stopped. The driver, a man with a face like crumpled parchment named Miller, didn't even look her in the eye when he swung the door open. The mountain air rushed in, smelling of pine and impending doom. He told her the horses were flagging, that the mud was too thick and the incline too steep, but it was the subtext that cut deeper than the wind. He looked at the way her silk skirts pressed tightly against the carriage seat, his gaze lingering on the soft curve of her jaw and the breadth of her shoulders with a flicker of resentment. "Too much of a load for a storm like this, Miss Davis," he'd muttered, his voice thin and cruel. "You'll find the way station just a mile up. I've got to turn back before the pass closes." Then he was gone. The taillights of the carriage vanished into the gray veil of falling snow, leaving Eleanor alone in a world that suddenly felt too large and too cold for her to occupy. She began to walk because there was nothing else to do. Every step was a battle against the physics of her own body and the malice of the elements. Her boots, designed for the paved streets of San Francisco, were quickly breached by the slush. The hem of her heavy wool coat dragged, gathering weight with every inch of snow it collected. To the society she had fled, Eleanor was a woman of excessive presence, a daughter whose father had tried to marry her off to aging widowers who saw her as a sturdy housekeeper rather than a bride. She had spent 24 years shrinking her spirit to compensate for the space she took up, but out here, in the howling white wilderness, there was no one to apologize to. The mile Miller had promised was a lie. 1 mile turned into 2, then 3, as the sky bruised into a deep, sickly purple. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, a banshee wail that stripped the heat from her skin and replaced it with a biting, rhythmic thrum of pain. Her lungs burned with every gasp of ice-thin air. Her vision began to tunnel, the dark silhouettes of the towering cedars dancing like ghosts in the periphery. She felt the seductive pull of the snow, the urge to simply lie down and let the white blanket tuck her in forever. At least then, she thought, with a bitter, freezing clarity, she would finally be light enough for the world to handle. Then, through the shimmering curtain of the blizzard, a spark appeared. It wasn't the steady glow of a way station, but a low, amber pulse of light. She blinked, certain it was a hallucination born of hypothermia. She pushed forward, her legs moving on instinct alone, until the silhouette of a cabin materialized.
It was a formidable structure, built of massive hand-hewn cedar logs that looked as though they had grown directly out of the mountainside. Smoke curled defiantly from a stone chimney, a ribbon of gray against the white chaos. With the last of her strength, she stumbled toward the porch. Her hands were too numb to knock properly. She threw her entire weight against the heavy oak door, the wood cold and unforgiving against her shoulder. It didn't budge at first, and a sob of pure terror escaped her cracked lips. She hammered again, a frantic, rhythmic plea for life. The door swung inward with a suddenness that made her gasp. Standing in the threshold was a man who seemed to swallow the very light of the room behind him. Henry Smith was a titan of a man, his shoulders nearly brushing the doorframe on either side. He was clad in buckskin and heavy furs, his beard a thick thicket of mahogany, and his eyes, sharp, flinty, and startled, settled on her with immediate intensity. For a heartbeat, time suspended. He looked at this bedraggled, shivering woman, her face flushed a violent red from the cold, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks, and his brow furrowed in a deep, visible displeasure. He lived on this mountain to avoid the world and its complications, and here was a complication draped in sodden wool and desperation. Please," Eleanor whispered. The word was barely a thread of sound, snatched away by the gale that pushed past her into his sanctuary. Henry's jaw tightened. He looked past her at the swirling abyss of the night, then back at her. He opened his mouth, his chest expanding, as if to deliver a stern dismissal, to tell her that his home was no place for a lady of her station. He looked at her fine, ruined clothes, and the sheer exhaustion etched into her features. But before the first word of rejection could leave his throat, the lantern light caught the moisture in her eyes, not just tears of cold, but a profound, shattering fear of being cast back into the dark. Eleanor felt the world tilt. The heat from the hearth behind him hit her like a physical blow, liquefying the last of her resolve. Her knees, which had carried her through miles of death, finally surrendered. She didn't hit the floor. Henry moved with a predator's grace, his large, calloused hands catching her under the arms before she could collapse. The impact of her weight against his chest was sudden, but he didn't stagger. He braced himself like an oak against the wind. As her head fell back against his shoulder, her consciousness flickering like a dying candle, she felt the sheer, overwhelming heat of him. For the first time in her life, she felt small, not because she had shrunk, but because the man holding her was vast enough to shield her from everything. Henry looked down on the woman fainted in his arms, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. The displeasure in his eyes didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else, a fierce, protective instinct that bypassed his logic and went straight to his marrow. He kicked the door shut against the screaming wind, the heavy thud echoing through the cabin like the closing of a tomb on her old life and the beginning of something he wasn't yet ready to name. In that moment, the storm outside was nothing compared to the one he felt stirring in his chest.
Chapter 2. The Silent Caretaker. The heavy thud of the door against the frame signaled the end of the world Eleanor had known and the beginning of a silent, fevered sanctuary. Henry Smith stood in the center of his cabin, the unconscious woman a dead weight in his arms, her sodden wool skirts dripping onto his meticulously swept floor. He let out a low, guttural huff of irritation. He had come to these mountains to escape the chatter of society, the demands of an empire he had built with blood and iron, and the relentless expectations of a world that never stopped taking. Now, the world had arrived on his doorstep in a flurry of frozen silk and desperation. He looked down at the woman, Eleanor, she had gasped, and felt the familiar prickle of resentment. She was a liability. She was a disruption. Yet as he carried her toward the oversized hearth, the annoyance began to fray at the edges, replaced by a stark clinical necessity. Her breathing was a shallow, terrifying rattle, and her skin, where it wasn't flushed a violent scarlet from the wind, was the color of curdled milk. He laid her atop the thick bearskin rug before the fire, his large hands working with practiced, unhesitating efficiency. He knew the laws of the mountain. Damp was death. With a grim set to his jaw, he began the task of removing her outer layers. It was a process of sheer utility, yet as he peeled away the ruined velvet and the sodden stays that constricted her, he found himself pausing. He had expected to feel only the burden of her size, but as he worked, he was struck by the soft, luminous quality of her skin and the elegant curve of her throat. Even in her state of near death, there was a quiet, stubborn dignity to her that he hadn't anticipated. He moved her to his own bed, a massive thing of carved oak and down-filled mattresses, and tucked her beneath layers of wool and heated stones. By midnight, the chill of the storm had been replaced by the fire of a rising fever. Eleanor began to toss, her head thrashing against the pillow as she muttered incoherent fragments of a life she was trying to flee. She spoke of too much and not enough, her voice a heartbreaking whimper that cut through the silence of the cabin like a blade. Henry sat in a low-backed chair by the bedside, a basin of cool water and a cloth in his lap. He was a man who had commanded ships and broken men, yet as he reached out to press the damp rag to her brow, his hand trembled with a sudden, inexplicable reverence.
His fingers, calloused from years of hauling ropes and felling timber, looked monstrous against the delicate slope of her temple. He expected her to flinch, even in her sleep, as if anticipating a blow or a mockery. Instead, at the touch of his hand, her breathing hitched and then leveled out. She leaned into his palm, seeking the coolness, seeking the strength. Henry watched her with a mounting fascination. In the dim amber glow of the dying fire, he studied the features that the world had apparently deemed unfortunate. He saw the high, noble arch of her eyebrows, the spray of freckles across a nose that was finely turned, and the lush, rose-petal softness of her mouth. He found himself wondering what kind of fools inhabited the valleys below if they couldn't see the masterpiece hidden beneath the exhaustion. The night wore on in a cycle of silent devotion. Henry didn't sleep. He tended the fire, he steeped willow bark into a bitter tea to break her sweat, and he watched the rise and fall of her chest with the intensity of a man guarding his most precious treasure. He had never been a gentle man. Life had not afforded him the luxury of softness, but with Eleanor, a strange, subterranean tenderness began to ache in his chest. He found himself smoothing her hair away from her face with a touch so light it was almost a prayer. He found himself whispering reassurances into the shadows, his deep, gravelly voice anchored in the storm, promising her that the mountain wouldn't take her, not while he stood watch. As the pre-dawn light began to filter through the frosted window panes, the violence of her fever finally broke. A fine sheen of sweat broke across her skin, and her movements grew still and peaceful. Henry let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since she first crashed through his door. He reached out one last time, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. He was a man of logic and iron, yet he could not deny the pull he felt toward this stranger. She was a woman who had been discarded by the world, and he was a man who had walked away from it. In the silence of the room, surrounded by the scent of cedar and wood smoke, the solitude he had once cherished suddenly felt like a hollow, echoing thing. He stood up, his joints popping from the long vigil, and walked to the window to watch the snow continue its relentless descent. He was still annoyed, he told himself. He still wanted his peace back. But as he looked at the woman sleeping in his bed, her face finally at rest, he knew the lie for what it was. He didn't want her to leave. He wanted to know the sound of her laugh. He wanted to see the color of her eyes when they weren't clouded by terror. He had spent years building a fortress around his heart, but Eleanor Davis had simply collapsed through the door, and the walls were already starting to crumble. The mountain man, who feared nothing in the wild, found himself terrified of the quiet, rhythmic sound of a woman's heartbeat.
Chapter 3. Warmth and Weight. The first thing Eleanor Davis became aware of was the weight. It was not the crushing, suffocating weight of the snow or the leaden exhaustion that had dragged her down into the white abyss, but a different kind of heaviness. The deep, enveloping warmth of wool blankets and the soft, cloud-like sink of a feather mattress. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was dreaming, drifting in some amber-hued afterlife where the cold could no longer reach her. But then, the sharp, rhythmic crackle of a fire and the rich, salt-heavy scent of frying bacon pulled her back to the world of the living. She opened her eyes, and the reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. The ceiling was made of massive, dark timber beams, and the air was thick with cedar and wood smoke. Memory returned in a violent rush. The blizzard, the cabin, the titan of a man with eyes like flint. Panic flared in her chest as she realized she was not in her own clothes. The ruined, sodden velvet of her traveling dress was gone, replaced by a soft, oversized cotton nightshirt that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. His shirt. Her face burned a crimson that had nothing to do with the winter chill. The humiliation was instantaneous and absolute. She imagined his large, calloused hands having to work through the layers of her clothing, having to lift her excessive weight from the floor to the bed. In polite society of the valley, a woman's body was a secret to be corseted and concealed. Here, she had been laid bare in all her vulnerability, a massive broken bird in a hunter's nest. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like water. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I must think I'm a monster, a nuisance." She could only imagine the irritation he felt having his mountain solitude violated by a woman who required so much space, so much effort, so much care. She felt like an intruder in a masterpiece, a smudge of ink on a clean page. "You're awake." The voice was a low rumble, more a vibration in the floorboards than a sound. Eleanor pulled the blankets up to her chin, her eyes wide, as Henry Smith stepped into the bedroom door. He was even more imposing in the daylight. The sun, reflecting off the snow outside, poured through the windows, silhouetting his massive frame and catching the glint of his mahogany beard. He carried a wooden tray with a steady, effortless grace that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. He didn't look at her with the pitying smirk of the carriage driver or the cold dismissal of her father's associates. In fact, he barely looked at her face at all, focusing instead on the task of clearing a space on the bedside table. I am so sorry," Eleanor stammered, her fingers clutching the wool blanket until her knuckles turned white. "I never meant to be such a burden. As soon as I can stand, I will leave. I won't be a nuisance a moment longer." Henry paused, a heavy cast-iron skillet held in one hand. He looked at her then, a long, inscrutable gaze that seemed to weigh her words and find them lacking. He didn't offer a polite contradiction. He didn't tell her she wasn't a burden. He simply set the tray down, heaped with thick-cut bacon, golden fried potatoes, and a cup of coffee so black it looked like ink. "Eat," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who didn't waste breath on trifles. He turned his back to her then, moving toward the hearth in the main room. Eleanor watched him through the open door. He moved with a silent, deliberate economy, his muscles rippling beneath his buckskin shirt as he lifted a log that would have taken 2 men to carry and tossed it into the fire as if it were a twig.
The hearth roared in response, sending a fresh wave of heat into the bedroom. He didn't speak, but his actions were a symphony of care. He refilled a copper kettle, moved a heavy chair closer to the heat so her boots could dry, and began to sharpen a knife with a rhythmic, soothing shink, shink, shink. Eleanor looked down at the food. It was a staggering amount, enough for a working man, and for a moment her old insecurities flared. Does he think I need this much because of my size? Is this a joke? But then she noticed the steam rising from the potatoes, the careful way the toast had been buttered to the very edges, and the fact that the coffee had been sweetened with a precious bit of honey. This wasn't the meal of a man who found her gross. This was the meal of a man who had watched her nearly die and was determined to pull her back from the edge. She took a tentative bite of the potato. It was perfectly seasoned, warm and grounding. As the heat of the food spread through her, the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. She wiped them away quickly, terrified he would see her as even more of a pitiful case. "The storm isn't done with us yet," Henry called out from the other room, his voice slightly louder to carry over the crackle of the logs. He didn't look back at her, giving her the privacy to weep or eat as she fit saw. "The pass is buried. You aren't going anywhere, Eleanor Davis." The way he said her name, with a slow, deep cadence that treated each syllable with respect, made her breath hitch. He hadn't called her Miss or the girl. He had used her name as if it carried weight, as if she carried weight that was worth supporting. She lay back against the pillows, the warmth of the food and the fire finally beginning to settle the trembling in her bones. She still felt mortified, still felt like a giant clumsy interloper in this sanctuary of wood and stone. But as she watched the mountain man move through his home, tending to the fire and the chores with a silent, unrelenting devotion to her comfort, the nuisance she felt she was began to feel a little less heavy. Henry Smith said almost nothing, but in the roaring heat of the hearth and the richness of the meal, he was telling her she was safe. And for Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime being told she was too much to handle, the silence of the mountain man was the loudest kindness she had ever known.
Chapter 4. The Mirage of Love. The storm became a living thing, a white titan that paced outside the cabin walls, rattling the cedar beams and sealing the world in a tomb of ice. Inside, the passage of time blurred into a cycle of firelight and shadow. For Eleanor, these days were a surreal suspension of reality. She had spent her life navigating the sharp corners of a society that wished she would simply occupy less space, yet here, in a cabin that smelled of dry pine and old leather, the space she took up seemed to be the very center of Henry Smith's world. He was a man of staggering silences, yet those silences began to feel less like a vacuum and more like a conversation. He did not hover, but he was always there. When her fever finally retreated, leaving her weak and shaken, he did not treat her with the brittle, forced politeness she was used to. Instead, he moved with a grounded, earthy focus on her needs. On the third afternoon, as the wind screamed particularly loud against the rafters, Eleanor sat by the hearth, struggling with the tangled, matted curls of her hair. The blizzard had turned her once neat tresses into a bird's nest of knots, and her trembling hands lacked the strength to win the battle. Henry watched her from across the room, where he was oiling a piece of harness. Without a word, he set aside his work and approached. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as his massive shadow fell over her. She expected him to offer a sharp comment on her dishevelment, but instead he reached out and took the comb from her hand. "Sit," he commanded softly. He knelt behind her on the bearskin rug.
Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable tugging, the pain, the silent judgment of a man dealing with a clumsy burden. But the touch that followed was so light it stole the air from her lungs. Henry worked with an agonizingly slow gentleness, starting at the very tips of her hair and teasing out the tangles with the patience of a craftsman. His large, scarred fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her neck, sending jolts of electricity through her that she had no name for. In that domestic intimacy, Eleanor felt a dangerous warmth brewing in her chest. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean back into the solid, radiating heat of his knees, imagining what it would be like if this were not a rescue, but a choice. But the moment the thought took root, the cold voice of her past withered it. "He is only doing this because you are a broken thing," she whispered to herself. "He is a man of the wild. He would show the same mercy to a trapped doe or a wounded hawk. Do not mistake pity for a pulse."
That evening, the subtle overtures continued. Henry disappeared into a small corner of the cabin and returned with a leather-bound volume, its spine cracked from years of handling. He placed it in her lap. It was a collection of poetry and philosophy, the margins filled with notes in a precise, elegant hand that she realized must be his. "It's my favorite," he said, his voice low vibration that seemed to settle in her very marrow. The words help when the mountain gets too quiet. Eleanor traced the gold leaf on the cover, her throat tight. He was sharing his soul with her, offering her the sanctuary of his thoughts. She found herself falling, slipping into the gravity of his quiet strength, his hidden intellect, and the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a gaze that felt less like flint and more like glowing embers. She fell for the way he made her tea with exactly the right amount of honey, and the way he moved his heavy desk just so the afternoon light would hit her chair. Yet, the more he showed her these affections, the more Eleanor's mind twisted them into a cruel mirage. She would catch sight of her reflection in the darkened window pane, the breadth of her arms, the softness of her face, and a wave of shame would wash over her. She was a woman who had been told by her own father that her only value was in her inheritance, a woman who had seen the way men's eyes slid past her in search of something more delicate, more manageable. How could a man like Henry Smith, a man who looked like he could command the very elements, ever truly want a woman like me? She wondered. The logic was cold and inescapable to her. He was wealthy in spirit, perhaps even in means, given the quality of the things in his home. He could have anyone. To believe he felt anything for her beyond the duty of a host towards a pathetic invalid was a delusion born of the fever. As the fourth night descended and the storm showed the first signs of breaking, the tension in the cabin grew thick. Henry sat near her, the firelight dancing in the depths of his dark eyes. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the arm of the chair, his fingers twitching as if wanting to close the gap. Eleanor pulled her hand away, feigning an interest in the book. She couldn't bear the thought that his touch might be a joke she wasn't in on, or a kindness he would regret once the sun came out and the burden was no longer an emergency. Henry's hand retreated, his jaw tightening as he looked into the fire. The silence that followed was heavy, no longer a conversation, but a wall. Eleanor felt the weight of her own self-doubt like a physical shroud, convincing herself that every beat of her heart for him was a mistake she would soon have to pay for. The storm was ending, and with it, she knew she had to find the strength to leave before the pity in his eyes turned into the one thing she couldn't survive, the truth of her own unworthiness. Chapter 5. The Flight from Fear. The dawn did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a blinding, crystalline shout.
The clouds that had choked the mountain for days finally tore asunder, revealing a sky of such piercing, glacial blue that it hurt to look upon. Sunlight hit the fresh snow, turning the world into a landscape of crushed diamonds, silent and terrifyingly beautiful. Inside the cabin, the light crawled across the floorboards like an intruder, eventually finding the bed where Eleanor Davis lay wide awake. She had not slept. She had spent the dark hours listening to the rhythmic, deep thrum of Henry Smith's breathing from the other room, a sound that had become her only anchor in the chaos. But as the sun rose, that anchor began to feel like a chain. She sat up slowly, her body aching with a phantom weight that went far beyond the physical. In the harsh, honest light of day, the intimacy of the past week felt like a fever dream that was rapidly evaporating. She looked at the soft cotton shirt she wore, his shirt, and felt a wave of nausea that was born of pure, unadulterated shame. She could see it all unfolding with agonizing clarity. The storm was over, the emergency had passed, and now the mountain man would be saddled with the reality of her presence. He would look at her across the breakfast table, no longer as a soul to be saved, but as a guest who had overstayed her welcome. He would see the way her heavy footsteps wore on his floors, the way she consumed his carefully rationed supplies, and eventually the flint in his eyes would sharpen into the edge of a blade. He would wonder when the unfortunate daughter intended to move on. She could not stay to see that look. She had seen it on the faces of suitors who were forced to sit in her father's parlor. She had seen it in the eyes of the carriage driver before he dumped her in the snow. To Eleanor, kindness was a finite resource, a candle that eventually flickered out, leaving the recipient in a darkness even more profound than before. If she left now, she could keep the memory of his gentleness as it was, a preserved, perfect thing, rather than watching it rot into resentment. Moving with a ghostly quietness she didn't know her large frame possessed, Eleanor slid out of bed. The floor was ice cold, but she welcomed the sting. It grounded her, pulling her away from the seductive warmth of the blankets. She found her clothes near the hearth. Henry had cleaned them. The mud was gone, the velvet brushed, and the wool dried to a soft, inviting loft. Even in her haste to flee, the sight of her mended hem brought a sob to her throat. He had spent his time, his precious solitary time, tending to the details of her life. Because he is a good man, she told herself as she struggled back into her corset and skirts, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely hook the eyes. A good man who deserves his mountain back, a man who shouldn't have to look at me and feel the burden of his own mercy. Once dressed, she looked toward the main room. Henry was asleep in the oversized chair by the fire, his head tilted back, the rugged lines of his face softened by exhaustion. He looked less like a titan and more like a man who had fought a war for a stranger's life. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long minute, her heart breaking with a quiet, devastating finality. She wanted to walk over and press a kiss to his brow, to thank him for the way he had brushed her hair and the way he had said her name. But she knew that if he woke, if he looked at her with those dark, searching eyes, her resolution would shatter like ice under a boot.
She found a scrap of paper on his desk and a lead pencil. Her hand shook as she wrote 3 simple words, "Thank you, Henry." She placed it on the table next to the book he had given her, the one with his soul in the margins. She couldn't take it with her. It was too precious to be carried into the life she was about to face. Stepping out onto the porch was like stepping into a different dimension. The air was so cold it turned to needles in her lungs, a sharp contrast to the cedar-scented warmth she was leaving behind. The snow was deep, waist-high in some drifts, but the wind had packed it down in places, creating a treacherous, shimmering crust. Eleanor didn't have a map, but she knew the general direction of the valley. She knew there was a town, a place where people like her could disappear into the machinery of domestic labor or the shadow of a kitchen. Every step was a monumental effort. Her skirts once again became anchors, catching on the hidden branches beneath the white surface. The sun, which had seemed so beautiful from the window, now beat down with a relentless, mocking glare, reflecting off the snow until her eyes burned and her head throbbed. She fell once, twice, her hands plunging into the freezing depths, her breath coming in ragged, desperate plumes. Each time she collapsed, the voice in her head grew louder. "Keep going. Don't let him find you. Don't let him see you like this. Clumsy, failing, too much." By midday, the cabin was a distant, dark speck against the vastness of the ridge. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic shush-shush of her boots and the pounding of her own heart. She felt smaller than she ever had in the city, a tiny, dark blemish on a canvas of infinite white. She was terrified, her toes losing feeling and her strength flagging, but she pushed onward toward the smudge of gray smoke on the horizon that signaled the town of Oakhaven. She was heading toward a life of anonymity, toward the harsh reality of being a woman alone with nothing but her unfortunate reputation. As she reached the final crest that looked down into the valley, Eleanor turned back one last time. The mountain stood tall, indifferent and magnificent, and somewhere in its folds was a man who had touched her soul. She let out a single jagged breath that crystallized in the air. She was free of the pity she feared, but as she began the long descent toward the town, she realized with a crushing weight that she had left the only piece of herself that mattered back in that cedar log sanctuary. She was fleeing from fear, but she was walking straight into a winter that no hearth could ever warm. Will Eleanor find the dignity she seeks in the world below, or has she traded a mountain sanctuary for a valley of thorns? If you are captivated by her journey and want to see if Henry can find her before the world breaks her spirit, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more of these frontier tales to life. Stay tuned, because the real storm is only just beginning.
Chapter 6. The Town of Thorns. The Valley of Thorns was not made of briars, but of eyes. Oakhaven was a scar of civilization on the edge of the wilderness, a collection of clapboard buildings and mud-slicked streets that smelled of wet timber, coal smoke, and the heavy metallic tang of unwashed labor. As Eleanor Davis descended the final ridge, the silence of the mountain was replaced by a cacophony of progress, the rhythmic ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouting of teamsters, and the frantic barking of dogs. To the residents of Oakhaven, the breaking of the storm meant a return to commerce. But for Eleanor, it felt like stepping into a theater where she was the only performer on a stage she had never asked to occupy. She smoothed her damp skirts, trying to summon a shred of the dignity she had felt in the cabin, but as she crossed the town limits, that dignity evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The first look she received was from a woman hanging laundry, a sharp-featured matron who stopped mid-motion to stare at the disheveled large woman stumbling out of the heights. The woman didn't offer a greeting, she simply nudged her neighbor, and the whispering began. It was a familiar music to Eleanor's ears, a low, buzzing hum of judgment that followed her as she made her way down the main thoroughfare. She was too tall, too wide, and currently too bedraggled to pass for anything other than a curiosity. Her fine velvet coat, once a symbol of her father's wealth, was now a salt-stained rag that only served to highlight how ill-fitted she was for this rugged world. She felt the weight of her body with a renewed, crushing intensity, a physical manifestation of her own unworthiness.
She stopped first at the Golden Pine boarding house, her heart thumping with a desperate hope. The proprietor, a woman with eyes like cold marbles named Mrs. Gable, didn't even let her finish her sentence. "We're looking for a girl who can move quick between the tables, dearie. Someone live. You'd be knocking over the tea service before the first course was served. Try the laundry down by the creek." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat and tried the general store, then the apothecary, and finally a small inn at the edge of town. Each time the result was the same, a polite refusal that masked a deep visual distaste or a blunt assessment of her physical suitability. "You're a sturdy one, aren't you?" a shopkeeper remarked, his voice dripping with a kind of mocking awe. "I don't have enough floor space for two of me, let alone one of you. Move along." By mid-afternoon, the cold of the valley had seeped into her marrow, a different kind of frost than the one on the mountain. This was the chill of being seen and found wanting, the confirmation that Henry's kindness had been a temporary aberration in a world that had no room for her. She was standing on a street corner, her hands tucked into her sleeves to hide their trembling, when a shadow fell across her. It wasn't the vast protective shadow of Henry Smith, but something thinner, more predatory. "A tragedy," a voice crooned, smooth as oiled silk, "to see a woman of such substantial presence left to the mercy of the wind."
Eleanor turned to see a man leaning against the post of a storefront. He was dressed in a suit of dark, expensive wool, a crimson velvet vest peeking out from beneath his lapels. His hair was slicked back with lavender pomade, and his mustache was trimmed to a precise, sharp line. This was Barnaby Graves, the owner of the Silver Petal Salon, a place that promised refinement to the miners and merchants of the town, though the town gossips whispered of darker things behind its velvet curtains. He stepped closer, his eyes raking over her, not with the revulsion she expected, but with a terrifying, calculating interest. He looked at her the way a butcher looks at a prize heifer or a slaver looks at a strong pair of shoulders. "You've had a hard run, Miss Davis," he said, and the fact that he already knew her name sent a shiver of dread down her spine. "The mountain is no place for a lady, and it seems the town is being particularly unneighborly today." "I am looking for work, sir. Honest work. I can clean, I can cook, I can manage accounts." "I have no doubt you are a woman of many talents," Graves interrupted, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And it just so happens I am in need of someone of your unique stature. The salon requires a certain kind of presence, someone to handle the heavy linens, the midnight cleanings, the security of the back entrance. It is difficult work, and the hours are demanding." He reached into his pocket and produced a gold-tipped cigar. "I can offer you a room, a warm bed, 3 meals a day, and a roof that doesn't leak. No one else in Oakhaven will give you a second glance, Eleanor. You know that. I am the only door that is open to you." Eleanor looked down the street at the cold, mocking faces of the townspeople, and then back at Graves. She felt the trap closing around her before he spoke the next words. "Of course," Graves added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "there is the matter of your debt for the housing and the food. A simple contract, really. A few years of service to pay off the investment I'm making in your potential. It's a small price to pay for safety, wouldn't you agree?" To Eleanor, whose worth had always been measured by what she could give and how little she could take, the offer sounded like a death sentence disguised as a lifeline. But as the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the mud, the memory of the freezing wind on the ridge returned to her.
She thought of Henry Smith sitting by his fire, likely already forgetting the woman who had brought so much noise to his silence. She felt a profound, hollow ache in her chest, a realization that she was truly alone. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," Barnaby Graves replied, his smile widening as he reached out a gloved hand to guide her toward the darkened entrance of the salon. As the sun descended beneath the horizon, casting its long skeletal shadows across the mud, the town of Thorns claimed its latest victim. Eleanor Davis walked into her new cage, her heart a leaden weight, unaware that miles away on the frozen peaks, the man she had left behind had found her empty bed and was currently arming himself with a fury that would soon set the entire valley ablaze.
Chapter 7. The Lion Awakes. The silence in the cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where the rhythm of another soul had been abruptly excised. Henry Smith stood in the doorway of the bedroom, his hand still gripping the cedar frame so tightly the old wood groaned in protest. The bed was made, the blankets pulled straight with a desperate, heartbreaking precision, but the warmth was gone. His gaze fell to the bedside table, where the small scrap of paper lay weighted down by the book he had given her. "Thank you, Henry." 3 words that carried the weight of 1,000 apologies she shouldn't have had to make. Henry picked up the paper, his large thumb brushing over the jagged, trembling script. He could see her in the letters, the way she had hurried, the way her breath must have hitched to the cold morning air, the way she had convinced herself that leaving was an act of mercy for him. He looked at the book, the one filled with his own private thoughts, and felt a surge of visceral, agonizing loss. He had offered her his world, and she had seen it only as a debt she couldn't pay. He didn't waste time with grief. He bypassed it entirely for the cold, sharpening clarity of purpose. He moved through the cabin with a predatory efficiency, his movements no longer the slow, careful gestures of a caretaker, but the lethal economy of a hunter. He strapped on his heavy furs, checked the action of his rifle, and slid a hunting knife into the sheath at his thigh. He didn't need a trail to know where she had gone. There was only one direction for a woman seeking to disappear, and that was down. The descent was a brutal testament to his fury. Henry didn't use the winding carriage paths. He cut straight through the vertical brush, his snowshoes treading over drifts that would have swallowed a lesser man. The mountain, which had tried to claim Eleanor, seemed to bow before his pace. He moved through the crystalline forest like a dark shadow, his breath coming in steady, rhythmic plumes of frost. Every mile he covered, his mind replayed the week they had shared, the way she had leaned into his hand while fevered, the way she had looked at him over the steam of a coffee cup. He realized then that he had been a fool. He had given her his silence, thinking it was peace, never realizing that she had been raised in a world where silence was a precursor to rejection. By the time he reached the outskirts of Oakhaven, the sun was beginning to cast long, bruised shadows across the valley floor. He was a terrifying sight to the townspeople, a giant of a man emerging from the frozen heights, draped in furs and armed for a war. He didn't stop to brush the rime from his beard or the ice from his boots. He walked straight into the heart of the town, his presence causing the chatter on the boardwalks to die in throats. He pushed open the heavy doors of the Black Dog Saloon, the scent of stale ale and cheap tobacco hitting him like a physical blow. The room was crowded with miners and teamsters celebrating the end of the storm. Henry scanned the room, his eyes flinty and dangerous, searching for a sign, a word, a trace of her. Near the bar, a group of men were huddled over a bottle of whiskey, their laughter loud and abrasive. Henry started to turn away until a specific phrase caught his ear, a sharp, jagged sound that made the air in the room suddenly feel thin.
I'm telling you, I haven't seen anything like it, a man with a crooked nose was saying, gesturing broadly with a glass. Rolled into town like a landslide, she did, that heavy girl from the mountain. Nearly broke the steps at Gables just by standing on 'em. Should have seen the look on her face when the old lady told her to head for the laundry, like a kicked dog, only 3 times the size. The men erupted into a chorus of sniggering, one of them miming a wide, lumbering gait. Saw Barnaby Graves taking her into the saloon earlier. Reckon he's found himself a new pack mule. God help the floorboards in that place. The laughter didn't end. It was cut short by a sound like a thunderclap. Henry didn't walk toward the bar. He seemed to cross the distance in a single blurred movement. He grabbed the man with the crooked nose by the front of his wool coat and slammed him upward against the bar rail. Glass shattered as bottles were knocked aside. The man's feet dangled inches off the floor, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he looked into the eyes of the man holding him. Henry didn't shout. His voice was a low, seismic rumble that caused the liquid in the remaining glasses to tremble. "You will speak of her with respect," Henry whispered, the words vibrating with a primordial violence, "or you will never speak again." The saloon went deathly quiet. The barkeep reached for a club beneath the counter, but one look at the rifle slung across Henry's back and the sheer, focused rage in his stance made him freeze. I didn't mean nothing by it, mister. I swear, it was just a joke." "Where is she?" Henry's grip tightened, his knuckles white against the dark fabric of the man's coat. The fury in him was a living thing now, a lion that had finally been poked through the bars of its cage. He thought of Eleanor, of her kindness and her soft, wounded heart being subjected to the filth of these men's tongues. It was more than he could bear. "She's at the Silver Petal," he gasped, clawing at Henry's wrists. "Graves, he took her in, said he had work for her in the back. Please, put me down." Henry dropped him. The man crumpled into a heap on the floor, gasping for air and clutching his throat. Henry didn't give him a second glance. He turned and walked back toward the doors, his boots thudding against the floorboards like the tolling of a funeral bell. He knew of Barnaby Graves. He knew the kind of work the man offered to the desperate and the discarded. As he stepped back out into the freezing night air, the lion was no longer just awake. He was on the hunt. The town of Oakhaven had spent the day mocking a woman who was too good for its muddy streets, and now it was going to learn what happened when you tried to cage something that belonged to the mountain. Henry Smith began to walk toward the glowing red lanterns of the Silver Petal, his heart a drum of war, ready to tear the valley apart to bring her home. Chapter 8. The Confrontation at the Square. The Silver Petal Salon stood like a gilded sore against the rough-hewn backdrop of Oakhaven, its crimson lanterns casting a sickly, theatrical glow over the town square. Barnaby Graves had not been content to simply lock Eleanor away in the darkness of his laundry rooms. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted the town to witness his philanthropy, to see the great, discarded daughter of a merchant prince sign away her freedom in exchange for the crumbs of his mercy. A small wooden table had been dragged onto the boardwalk, a heavy leather-bound ledger resting upon it like a headman's block. The townspeople gathered in a loose, shivering semicircle, their breaths blooming in the freezing air as they watched the woman who had become the day's cruelest entertainment. Eleanor stood beside the table, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped under the weight of 1,000 judging eyes. She felt exposed, a mountain of velvet and shame under the flickering lamplight. To the miners and the gossips, she was a curiosity, a woman too large for the world's grace. To Barnaby Graves, she was an asset to be worked until the marrow was gone. He stood beside her, his hand resting with a proprietary, oily heaviness on her shoulder. "Now, my dear," Barnaby's voice drifted over the crowd, smooth and rehearsed. By signing this, you acknowledge the debt of your rescue and the cost of your sanctuary. It is a fair trade, a home for a soul. Surely you realize that outside these lights there is nothing for a woman of your particular requirements. Eleanor reached for the pen, her fingers numb with a cold that went deeper than the mountain frost. She looked at the jagged line where her life was supposed to end and her servitude was to begin. A sob caught in her throat. She thought of the cabin, the scent of cedar, and the way Henry's hands had felt in her hair. She convinced herself that this was her penance for believing, even for a moment, that she was worthy of a man like him. Just as the nib touched the paper, a sound began to roll through the square, a rhythmic, heavy thudding that was not the beating of her heart, but the thunder of hooves on frozen mud. The crowd parted with a collective gasp of terror as a massive black stallion, its coat lathered with sweat and its eyes wild, charged into the light. Atop the beast sat a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very granite of the peaks. Henry Smith did not slow down. He pulled the horse into a rearing halt inches from the boardwalk, the animal's primal scream cutting through the silence of the square. Henry's furs were dusted with snow, his rifle slung across his back, and his expression was of such singular, lethal focus that even Barnaby Graves stepped back, his slick smile faltering into a mask of pale fear. "Step away from her, Graves," Henry said. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very teeth of everyone standing in the square. "Now see here, Smith," Barnaby stammered, clutching the ledger to his chest. "This is a legal matter. The girl is destitute. She's a vagrant. I am offering her—" "You are offering her a cage," Henry interrupted, swinging down from the saddle with a grace that belied his massive size. He stepped onto the boardwalk, the wood groaning beneath his boots. He didn't look at Barnaby. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Eleanor. He saw the tears frozen on her cheeks. He saw the way she was trying to shrink herself, even now, trying to disappear into the shadows of the porch. The fury that had driven him down the mountain spiked into something hotter, something more protective. He turned to face the townspeople, his gaze sweeping over them like a scythe. "I have listened to the whispers of this town since I set foot in the valley. I have heard you mock what you cannot understand. You look for beauty in the fragile, in the dainty, in the things that break under the first sign of a mountain wind. You call this woman too much because your own hearts are too small to hold her." He stepped closer to Eleanor, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. He reached out, and this time he didn't hesitate. He took the pen from her hand and snapped it in two, the wood splintering with a sharp, final crack. He tossed the pieces at Barnaby's feet. "You look at her, and you see a burden, but I have watched her walk through a storm that would have buried every one of you. I have seen the strength in her spirit and the nobility in her silence. You think she is an invalid because she required a hearth? I say she is a queen who was simply waiting for a throne high enough for her to sit upon." Eleanor looked up, her breath hitching. "Henry, you don't have to. You're just being kind because—" "No," Henry growled, the words soft but absolute. He stepped into her space, his massive hands reaching out to frame her face. He didn't care about the witnesses. He didn't care about the scandal. He forced her to look at him, to see the raw, unvarnished truth in his flinty eyes. "I am not being kind, Eleanor. I am being selfish. I spent years on that mountain thinking I wanted peace, but I was just waiting for a reason to come back to life. You are that reason." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "They call you excessive. They call you a nuisance. Let them." His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear, yet it felt like a shout in the silence of her heart. "Eleanor Davis,
You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, not despite your weight, but because of the space you occupy in a world that is too thin to deserve you. You are the mountain, and I am finally home." A shocked silence fell over the square. Barnaby Graves opened his mouth to protest, but the look Henry leveled at him, a promise of absolute destruction, made him choke on his own breath. Eleanor felt a warmth spreading through her that no fire could ever mimic. The shame that had been her constant companion for 24 years didn't just fade, it disintegrated. She looked at the man holding her, really looked at him, and saw not a rescuer, but a partner. "Henry," she whispered, her voice finally finding its strength. Take me back to the mountain." Henry didn't say another word. He lifted her as if she were nothing but starlight and silk, settled her onto the front of his saddle, and swung up behind him. He gathered the reins, his chest a solid radiating wall against her back. With one final contemptuous look at the town of thorns, he turned the stallion toward the heights. The crowd watched in stunned, mute silence as the giant and his queen rode out of the light and back into the shadow of the peaks, leaving the contract in the mud and the valley's cruelty far behind.
Chapter 9. The Queen of the Mountain. The ascent back into the clouds was a silent, soaring triumph. Behind them, the flickering lanterns of Oakhaven faded into insignificance, their cruel judgment swallowed by the vast, unblinking shadows of the pines. Eleanor leaned back against Henry's chest, the rhythm of his heart beneath her shoulder blades acting as a new, steadier tempo for her life. The cold no longer bit. It merely highlighted the radiating heat of the man who held her as if she were a prize he had spent a lifetime seeking. When they finally crossed the threshold of the cabin, the heavy cedar door clicking shut against the world, the silence that followed was no longer a vacuum of uncertainty. It was the quiet of a kingdom finally at rest. In the days that followed the confrontation at the square, the truth of the mountain man began to unravel in a series of startling, shimmering revelations. It started with a group of riders who arrived not with insults, but with trunks of fine silk, crates of French champagne, and a man in a tailored charcoal suit who bowed so low to Henry that his forehead nearly touched the frozen porch. Henry Smith had not merely walked away from the world, he had conquered it first. He was the Smith of the Smith Maritime Empire, the man whose fleets had bridged the Pacific and whose name was whispered in reverence in the boardrooms of London and San Francisco. He had retreated to the peaks not because he had failed, but because he had grown weary of a society that valued the shimmer of a coin more than the weight of a soul. "I have more than enough to buy that entire valley and turn it into a grazing pasture for my horses, Eleanor," Henry said one evening, his voice soft as he watched her run her hands over a bolt of ivory lace that had been delivered by a special courier. "But I realized long ago that all the gold in California couldn't buy a single moment of the truth I found in this room with you. I don't want the empire back. I want the queen I found in the storm." Eleanor looked at the lace, then at her own reflection in the polished silver of a tea service that now sat upon the rough-hewn table. For the first time, she didn't look for the flaws. She didn't see the excessive woman who had been a disappointment to her father. She saw the woman who survived the Sierra Nevada, the woman who was brave enough to walk into the dark to save her own dignity, and the woman who was cherished by a titan. The realization hit her with the force of an avalanche. She was not too much. She was a landscape vast enough to match his own. She was the only person with enough presence to fill the void he had carved out in the wilderness. The wedding was a spectacle that Oakhaven would speak of for generations, though most were only allowed to watch from the periphery of the ridge.
Henry had transformed the mountain clearing into a cathedral of ice and light. Thousands of candles in glass hurricanes lined the path, their flames reflecting off the snow like fallen stars. A string quartet had been brought up from the coast, the delicate trill of violins dancing through the cedar boughs. When Eleanor emerged from the cabin, she did not try to shrink herself. She wore a heavy, shimmering satin that caught the moonlight, the ivory fabric flowing over her curves with a regal, unapologetic grace. She walked toward Henry with her head held high, her footsteps firm and sure on the earth. He stood at the makeshift altar, dressed in a suit of midnight blue that made him look like the king of the very peaks surrounding them. When he took her hands, his eyes were bright with a profound, shattering awe. "God, Eleanor, you are magnificent." The ceremony was short, a binding of two souls who had already been forged together in the fire of a blizzard. As they stood before the few witnesses Henry had deemed worthy, captains of his ships and the few townspeople who had shown Eleanor a shred of kindness, the power dynamic of her life shifted forever. She was no longer a refugee of the valley, she was the mistress of the mountain. As the music swelled and the champagne was poured, Eleanor stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out over the silent, moonlit expanse. She felt the weight of her wedding ring, a heavy band of gold set with a diamond as clear as mountain water. Henry stepped up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, drawing her back into his warmth. "They were right about one thing, you know," she murmured, leaning her head back against his shoulder. Henry stiffened, his grip tightening protectively. "Who was right, if any of those fools in town still have something to say?" "No," Eleanor laughed, a rich, melodious sound that echoed through the pines. "The people in the valley. They said I was too much for Oakhaven, and they were right. I was always meant for something bigger than a town of thorns. I was meant for this. I was meant for you." Henry turned her in his arms, his flinty eyes now soft with a love that was absolute and unyielding. "You look, Eleanor," his voice breaking with a profound, shattering awe, like the morning sun finally hitting the summit. "God, Eleanor, you are magnificent." In the high, thin air of the Sierra Nevada, the woman who had been discarded found her throne. The storm had passed, the debts were paid, and the queen of the mountain finally knew that her weight was not a burden, but the very foundation upon which a new, beautiful world had been built.
Wasn't that a journey worth taking? If you felt the heat of that cabin and the triumph of Eleanor's spirit, don't let the story end here. We have so many more cinematic tales of grit, romance, and frontier justice waiting for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and join our community. It's the most important thing you can do to ensure these stories keep coming. Like this video, drop a comment telling us your favorite moment, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their own worth. Subscribe today and never miss a chapter of the legends we're building together.